Hi class, this is Dr. Mark Price again. This week we're still looking at utilitarianism. We're going to be looking at chapter 4 in Mill's book, Utilitarianism. And in chapter 4, what we get is a proof for hedonism, such as it is. Now, it's an unusual proof. It is perhaps the most difficult part of the text. So I wanted to take a few minutes and walk you through the first part of the proof and talk about a problem that many people have seen, and then I'm going to try to make that problem go away. Okay, so hedonism, remember, is the view that pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically good. But really we can think of it as claiming two things: that pleasure is intrinsically good and that pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically good. But even that first part, we need evidence for that. You know, where is the evidence that pleasure is a good and that it's somehow tied to morality? We need an argument that concludes with, therefore, pleasure is intrinsically good. What are the premises to this argument? What is the evidence that Mill can offer that we would look at this evidence and go, oh, okay, I see, pleasure is, in fact, intrinsically good? Now, Mill begins chapter 4 with this unusual statement that I've quoted here. He says, questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof in the ordinary acceptation of the term. So they do admit of proof, but in some non-ordinary way. So Mill's offering a non-ordinary or an extraordinary proof. So the question is, what sort of evidence can be offered to demonstrate that pleasure is good for its own sake? That's what we're asking Mill, and Mill says the only evidence possible is that people desire pleasure for its own sake. So he says, you know, to try to prove that pleasure is good for its own sake, I can't give you any sort of ordinary proof. I've got to give you a non-ordinary proof. And he says, the only thing I can do to prove to you that pleasure is good for its own sake is to show that people desire pleasure for its own sake. That's it. People want it. They think it's good for its own sake. Now, the problem is that many people, since this was published in 1861, have believed that Mill is equivocating in this argument, that he's making a mistake, that he's committed a fallacy. In fact, when I was sitting in your seat taking this philosophy class, my professor taught me that Mill equivocates. Now, to equivocate, you may not be familiar with this term. To equivocate is to change the meaning of a word, especially in the context of an argument. So when I'm offering you an argument, and I'm trying to offer premises that lead to a conclusion, and I change the meaning of a word, then I've equivocated. And I'll end up with an invalid argument. I'll end up with a fallacy. Let me give you a silly example, okay? And I used to do this in terms of ham and cheese sandwiches, and then somewhere along the way I had an undergraduate who gave me this example, and I've used it ever since. I don't recall his name, but cheers to him. He said, nothing beats a bud. That was the commercial anyway, right? But natural light is better than nothing. You know, here in Missouri, we do a lot of what's called floating. We load our canoes up with gear, and we take off down the river. Well, you know, when you're floating down the river, a natural light's better than nothing, assuming you like beer at all. And so, therefore, natural light is better than bud. Okay, so let's review this. Premise 1, nothing beats a bud, but natural light is better than nothing. Therefore, natural light is better than bud. Well, obviously something has gone wrong in this argument. That doesn't work. What's gone wrong? Well, what's gone wrong is that I've equivocated on the word nothing. Because nothing can have more than one meaning, as many words in English can. Nothing can have more than one meaning. Nothing can mean there does not exist a thing such that, and that's how I used it in the first premise, there does not exist a thing such that that thing is better than Budweiser. But nothing can also mean no thing at all. And that's how the word gets used in the second premise. Natural light is better than no thing at all. So by equivocating, by using the word nothing in these different senses, I end up trying to conclude something that just doesn't follow. I've committed a fallacy. It's an invalid argument by changing the meaning of the word in the context of the argument. So Mill says that he can prove that pleasure is desirable for its own sake. And he says the way to prove that pleasure is desirable for its own sake is the same way as proving that something is visible. If I were going to prove that something is visible, I would show that someone sees it, right? If I were going to prove that something is audible, then I would show that someone hears it. Mill says it's the same way. If I'm going to prove that something is desirable, then I need to show that it is in fact desired. So if I'm going to prove that pleasure is desirable, he need only show that pleasure is desired. That's all he needs to do, he says. Well, everyone desires pleasure, and everyone desires pleasure for its own sake. We all want to feel good, or if we're talking about happy, we all want to be happy. We all desire happiness. So therefore, pleasure is desirable for its own sake. Right? That's Mill's argument. He says the only way to prove that something is desirable for its own sake is to show that people in fact desire it for its own sake. In the same way that if I were going to show that something were visible, show that someone sees it, audible, show that someone hears it, desirable, show that someone desires it. Many people think that he's equivocated here with the word desirable, because he's supposed to be proving that pleasure is good for its own sake. Right? This is a proof for hedonism, the view that pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically good. Now, he's not using the word good when he starts proving hedonism. Instead, he starts using the word desirable. Well, that's okay. As a reader, we say, because desirable is synonymous with good. So Mill's going to prove that hedonism is true. That is, he's going to prove that pleasure is the only thing good for its own sake. But instead of good, he uses desirable. Fine, that's okay. We understand desirable to be a synonym with good. It means something like worthy of desire, right? If I were to say, getting your bachelor's degree is desirable, well, that's what I mean. I mean it's worthwhile. But then he makes this analogy with visible and audible. In the context of his argument there, he said, okay, the way to prove that something is desirable is the same as proving that something is visible, same as proving that something is audible. Well, visible means capable of being seen, and audible means capable of being heard. So in that context, desirable must mean capable of being desired. How am I going to prove that something is desirable? Show that someone desires it. Absolutely, if by desirable we mean capable of being desired. But isn't there a difference between saying that someone desires it and that it's good? So pleasure is capable of being desired for its own sake. How do we get from that to therefore pleasure is good for its own sake? That seems like an unsubstantiated leap. Mill has shown that people do in fact desire pleasure for its own sake. And it looks like then he's taken that, and then tried to conclude that pleasure is good for its own sake. But that's an equivocation. That we've equivocated on the word desirable. We've gone from capable of being desired to worthy of desire. And it's easy to imagine someone objecting and saying, look, you can offer evidence all day long that something is desired, and that's no evidence for that thing being good. That's an invalid argument. Here's my defense of Mill. I don't think he's equivocating. And, it's a very subtle argument. He told us at the beginning it's not an ordinary argument. Mill's view is that there is no other sense of good besides that people think it's good. And you can remember, if you remember back in chapter 2 last week when we were talking about the distinction between intellectual pleasures and physical pleasures. Remember that. And, the question was, well, why are intellectual pleasures better than physical pleasures? And Mill's answer is, well, because people think they are. Right? So for Mill, there is no other sense of good besides what people think. And, what people desire. And what people desire is good. And so his view is, in fact, when someone desires something, that means that it is good. So he's not drawing a distinction between something being desired and something being good. In fact, those are the same. And if we take it one more step and we say, okay, well, when someone desires something X for its own sake, that implies that that thing is good for its own sake. Everyone desires pleasure for its own sake. Everyone desires happiness for its own sake. We all do. We want it for no reason. We think it's good. And so it is. So it is good. Pleasure is good for its own sake because everyone wants it for its own sake, because everyone thinks it's good for its own sake. And in Mill's theory, in Mill's thinking, there is no other sense of good. It doesn't make sense to say that something is good and mean something other than people want it. So there's no mysterious quality that rests in good things. Good things are good because people think they're good. That's Mill's view.